For 1,000 nights, Demolition was the toughest, most dominant tag team in the World Wrestling Federation. They were champions for longer than anyone in history up until that point, and became an almost unstoppable force. But then, at their absolute peak, everything crumbled, and eventually, their legacy was erased. Before they became Demolition, these two men had very different origin stories. Axe was Bill Eadie, better known to fans in Georgia Championship Wrestling as the Masked Superstar, where he'd built a reputation as a reliable heel. But he wasn't just a singles wrestler, he was also a proven tag team specialist as one half of the Mongols, and that experience would be valuable in the WWF. Then there was Smash, played by Barry Darsow. He worked for Jim Crockett as Crusher Khrushchev, a bruising Russian heel. His hard and rugged style turned out to be the perfect foundation for the Demolition gimmick. But Demolition wasn't born from some kind of creative genius, they were born from business necessity. During the late 80s, the WWF was expanding nationally, but it had one gap in its product, and that was the tag team division. The WWF's tag teams were viewed as second-rate compared to the competition, specifically those in Jim Crockett promotions. And the biggest reason for that gap was the phenomenon known as the Road Warriors. Hawk and Animal were the hottest team in American wrestling. They were insanely over in the South and the Midwest, and even over in Japan. They were a spectacle, the kind of act that made other tag teams look out of their depth. Fans were buying tickets just to see these guys beat the crap out of anyone put in front of them. Vince McMahon had tried to sign the Road Warriors for months, but they were locked into a long-term contract with Jim Crockett, and they didn't really want to jump ship anyway. Vince's solution to this problem was simple. If the WWF couldn't buy the top act, then they would build their own version. It started with the visual aesthetic. The look was a fusion of hard rock, post-apocalyptic fiction, and horror movie themes. Their attire was similar to Lord Humongous from the Mad Max 2 movie, and the face paint was inspired by the band Kiss. But the process of creating a badass tag team hit a roadblock right at its debut. The original version of Smash was played by Randy Colley, the man formerly known as Moondog Rex. During their debut, the fans immediately recognised him, and they started chanting Moondog over and over. And so Randy was out the door, and Barry Darsow came in. Vince had seen tapes of him playing Crusher Khrushchev and loved his hard-hitting style of working, knowing that it would be perfect for Demolition. Darsow had even spent time feuding with the Road Warriors in the NWA, so he understood what made them tick. And because he had no history in the WWF, the fans weren't going to recognise him. Johnny Valiant was the original manager for Demolition, but Axe felt that he wasn't a very good fit. The Road Warriors had Paul Ellering by their side, and he perfectly complemented the team, while Johnny V was just too loud and energetic by comparison. And so Mr. Fuji took his place as the devious heel manager. The final product was a competitor for the Road Warriors, but they were different enough to be unique. Their in-ring psychology was to be slow and plotting in their demolishing of their opponents. They aimed to make every move look as painful as possible. Just like the Road Warriors, Demolition started off as a heel team that smashed through baby faces with almost no remorse. Their signature move was the Demolition Decapitation, and it became every bit as famous as the Road Warriors' Doomsday Device. In their first year, they steamrolled through teams like the Killer Bees, the Rougeau Brothers, the British Bulldogs, and even the Islanders. Early in their run, they destroyed Brady Boone on television, which kicked off their first real feud with Ken Patera and Billy Jack Haynes, and Demolition spent most of it tossing them around like furniture. But their breakthrough moment came at WrestleMania 4 in 1988, when they beat Strikeforce for the tag team titles. This reign lasted an incredible 478 days and established them as the longest running tag team champions in WWF history at that time. During this period, something unexpected happened. Although they were being booked as monster heels, their hard-hitting style started getting cheers from the fans. Of course, McMahon saw dollar signs, and so he had no choice but to turn them face. The shift came at the Survivor Series in 1988. During a match against the newly arrived Powers of Pain, Mr. Fuji betrayed Axe and Smash. He pulled the rope down, causing Smash to fall to the floor, resulting in a count-out loss. This double cross created immediate sympathy for Demolition, as the Barbarian and the Warlord became the new top heel team in the company. It was one of the best double turns in wrestling history, and the crowd switched sides instantly. It wasn't long before Demolition became one of the WWF's top merchandise movers. The fans just couldn't get enough of them. Even after they lost the titles to the Brainbusters in a 2 out of 3 falls match in July 1989, it didn't stop their popularity. They were the engine that drove the WWF's tag division for over 3 years, and they absolutely cemented their status as legends. Their last big triumph came at WrestleMania 6 when they beat Haku and Andre to become tag team champions once again. But while they stood at their peak in 1990, they were a dynasty on borrowed time. Axe was developing serious back problems that were making life on the road difficult for him, and things got even worse on a tour of Japan when he suffered a violent allergic reaction to shellfish. It was severe enough that by his own account, his heart actually stopped. From that point on, Axe's health went into steady decline, and the WWF knew they had a problem. Demolition was still a huge draw, and the company didn't want to break them up, so they looked for a way to keep the act alive. And the solution came from adding an extra man to the team. This was Brian Adams, who had just signed a contract with the company. He'd been trained in Japan by Antonio Inoki, but he was still very green. Crush immediately slotted into Demolition as a third man, while they already held the tag team titles. He hadn't even wrestled a single match in the company, and he walked in with a belt around his waist. This was a setup inspired by the old Freebird rule, meaning the group could defend the titles with any 2 members. On paper it solved the problem, but the fans rejected it. Adding the extra man disrupted their energy, and the crowd just knew that Crush didn't deserve to be there. Demolition turned heel in 1990 as they started cheating during their matches. They swapped each other out mid-match, jumped opponents 3-on-2, and cut every corner that they possibly could. But in July 1990, the Road Warriors finally arrived in the WWF, now known as the Legion of Doom, and this is where Demolition started to become obsolete. Vince McMahon finally got what he'd always wanted. He'd tried to sign the Road Warriors back in 1986, but Jim Crockett Promotions had locked them down with guaranteed contracts. But by 1990, that world was gone. WCW was now being run by Jim Herd, who they didn't get along with, and the Warriors were growing frustrated with the company's direction. When their contracts began winding down, Vince moved fast. He offered better money, national exposure, and the chance to finally bring the Road Warriors into his world. He changed their name simply because the Ultimate Warrior was already on the roster. Their arrival immediately shifted the landscape, and it pushed Demolition down the ladder. Their heel turn was to position them against LOD, but they weren't treated equally. Demolition faced the Hart Foundation at SummerSlam, and it all came to a head when Hawk and Animal stormed out and dragged Axe from under the ring. The Hart Foundation took advantage, and Demolition lost the titles. For the next few months, Demolition was steamrolled by the Legion of Doom over and over again on house shows and even on television. Every time they shared the ring, the message was the same. LOD were far superior to Demolition. And Axe was getting pissed off with his status in the team. They tried to reposition him as the team's manager, but he felt like a third wheel. Now he was working fewer matches and he was getting paid significantly less. The company offered him a backstage role, but they couldn't come to terms. He left the company entirely, after the Survivor Series in 1990. To explain his sudden absence, WWF President Jack Tunney announced that only 2 members of Demolition would be allowed going forward. This left Smash and Crush to carry the flag, but the magic was long gone. Fans never really accepted the new pairing. In fact, they never accepted Crush in the first place, and the team was downgraded even further. They briefly reunited with Mr. Fuji in an attempt to recapture their aura, but it didn't work. After a final run of matches, including a 4-minute loss at WrestleMania 7, they quietly disbanded in the summer of 1991 without any real explanation. One of the most dominant teams in WWF history simply vanished. Following their demise, Crush was turned into a singles wrestler and Smash became the Repo Man. The transformation for Barry Darsow was incredible. In order to not be recognised as Smash, he lost a load of weight and cut his hair. He even adopted a high-pitched voice to avoid being recognised. And of course, there was that iconic eye mask. When Repo Man faced Crush at SummerSlam 1992, most fans had no idea that they used to be tag team partners. But the final act of destruction for Demolition wasn't in the ring, but in the courtroom. For decades, one of the greatest tag teams in WWE history was effectively erased from the company's narrative. Bill Eadie filed a lawsuit against the company, attempting to acquire the rights to the Demolition name and his gimmick. He'd been using knockoff versions of the gimmick such as Axis the Demolisher on the independent circuit and in Japan, leading to a series of copyright disputes with the company. He was even joined in the lawsuit by Randy Colley, the original version of Smash, who also wanted royalties for the character, but a 1997 court decision ruled entirely in the WWF's favour. The court found that the company owned all of the copyrights and the men were left with nothing. The second battle came years later in 2016. Both Bill Eadie and Barry Darsow were named plaintiffs in a major class action concussion lawsuit filed against WWE. Although this lawsuit was ultimately dismissed, the hostilities meant that Demolition were ignored by the company for another few years. During that time, WWE even kept the New Day's title reign going long enough to surpass Demolition's record, removing their name from the top of the record books. Darsow himself has said that he believes that all this bad blood is the reason WWE has never put either of them in the Hall of Fame. But things might be about to change for Demolition. In 2025, both men signed a Legends deal which hints that the company may be ready to finally bring them back into the fold. And the truth is, they did far better than anyone expected from a team once dismissed as a copycat. They took a borrowed concept and turned it into something truly unique and legendary, something that lasted longer and mattered more than anyone predicted. Sometimes the most memorable stories in wrestling are the ones that were never meant to happen, and Demolition is one of them.